Well, happy Tuesday morning, everybody. I'm MJ Bolt, your host of UnBolted, and we've got an exciting episode for you today. We've got GR Mobley and Michelle Andres with us to talk about some very important content around our Constitution and how we can start using it more effectively here in our state. So, welcome, GR and Michelle. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's start with a little bit of introduction to help people get to know who you are and how you got here, kind of maybe some things you've done that have led you to getting into this content and why this is important to you. GR, do you want to start?
Actually, ladies first. How about that?
Oh,
Okay, that's fair. All right, Michelle. And Michelle,
I was really going to defer to him.
Well, no, you don't get off that easy, Michelle.
Okay.
So yeah, tell everybody a little bit about you.
Well, things kind of started for me when I married and came home and had all this energy from being in the work field. And this wonderful lady named Baronelle Stutzman from Arlene's Flowers was being sued right down to her wedding ring for simply saying, "I'm not comfortable doing your wedding," even though she'd had an 11-year relationship with these two gentlemen. And it exploded, and it was 12 years of agony. And I started to realize I'd been traveling on my job prior a lot, so I wasn't getting a lot of news incomplete. And when I sat down, I kept seeing stories where nothing made sense. What was happening to our country, not just our culture, but our country? And as I really started praying about it, from a previous position as an admissions counselor, I met the assistant to David Barton, and her daughter became a student at the college I was working at. And this whole wall builders thing was amazing. So I invited him to come and had no advertising dollars, did everything word of mouth and PSAs, and 3,000 people showed up. So I knew that it had hit a nerve, that it hit something, a need. So then you move forward, and we've seen all these years in Washington State where things keep happening that are violating people's rights. We're getting taxed to death. We are not heard. Parental rights are stripped from us. And it drove me to look deeper. And there was a suit, a civil suit that was put against Bob Ferguson. It had about 10 different things in it, all legitimate. And by simply putting a complaint against that attorney, a grievance, and later she was stripped of her law license completely, there was no voice. And I was even zoomed in like we are today during that hearing. And it was the most ridiculous lack of representation. They wouldn't let her speak. They countered her at every move. And basically, you could just see the adjudicator and the attorney for the state working together to just shut them up. And I'm in that process of trying to vet that lawsuit and go in a criminal direction. The sheriffs and the prosecuting attorneys really didn't know what to do with it. I ran into GR, and GR started talking about constitutional compliance committees, how it's not even a partisan issue. And I started learning about the ratification debates. So it'd be like you and I sitting in a room like this right now and having Jefferson and Madison tell us, yes, this is what the Constitution means. And all those debates that they had with Madison and many other people when the 13 original states first came together. And we have that history, but we've lost contact with it. GR, now I'm going to hand the baton off to GR. GR went back and reviewed the history and did what he called an audit of the Constitution. And that's going to be a part of our discussion today. And it was an eye-opener for me. It's like, we have these tools. It does not matter if we're a smaller party or it doesn't matter what party we're in. We have to go back to the Constitution. And if we don't, there's this beautiful thing called Amendment 14, Section 3 that says we remove a person from office. And there's not this massive court case. It is a direct grievance of the people with their government, which was how our country was founded. So I'll hand it off there, GR. Your turn.
Okay. So I was really fortunate to have two godly parents, and I joined the Marine Corps. And as I was joining the Marine Corps, my father nudged me and says, "You're going to take an oath. And you better understand what that oath means, because you're putting your life on the line because of that oath." So from that point, I started, I was not a very serious person. As a matter of fact, even to this day, I have a bad habit of telling levity or using levity in jokes and so forth. And some people tell me that'll be my demise. I'll probably, really piss somebody off with a joke. And anyway, I digress. So I actually started reading and learning what I could about the Constitution. And unfortunately, way back then, this was right around the advent of electricity. They only had the Anti-Federalist and the Federalist Papers, and other biographies. But getting your hands on source documents were really hard until the advent of the internet. So I just read biographies and became very literate in other people's eyes or their opinions of what happened. And then I really started, once I got my hands on the ratification debates and other source documents, and that was in the mid 90s, right about the time I was retiring from the Marine Corps. And that's when I realized that we had a problem. As a matter of fact, I spent a lot of time arguing and debating with my father, whose major was political science. And so we talked about the advent or the concept of a constitutional convention in the 80s. We talked about this, that, and the other thing. We realized that there's got to be a solution, but obviously the convention can't do it, because understanding one thing about the Constitution, if the Constitution is the problem, it must be amended. But the Constitution is not the problem. Not even the Convention of States folks will tell you, here's the problem. We need to get rid of these things in the Constitution. And they say, oh, well, we need to clarify it. Actually, if you've never read the ratification debates, then you would say that. But the ratification debates clarify every line in that Constitution, because the Anti-Federalists during those debates were doing everything they possibly could to scuttle this Constitution. There were 6 states that were aggressively trying to stop the advent of this new era of government, because they were trying to protect their power base. These states were literally the problem. This is one of the reasons why the Articles of Confederation were literally driving us into ruin, because the Articles of Confederation did not have the energy necessary for the government to sustain itself. We couldn't even pay our debts. And as a matter of fact, as we start looking at the ineptness of the Articles of Confederation, and I know I really hit nerves with people, but when you actually go through the history, before the Articles of Confederation were actually ratified, they already had 3 amendments to it. 3. And it only survived just a very few short period of time. What really would have happened had we not had the Constitution, this is the fact, that in 1790, during the French Revolution, and France would have looked at our debt, and we're not paying a penny. And I think Napoleon Bonaparte, when he came to power, would have said, you know what? We're going to take care of America first before we start dealing with Europe. Wow. And that would have been an advent that would have basically taken us into ruin. And I think that when we really look at the Constitution superseded everything. And I'll even go over this little sacred ground of the Northwest Ordinance, because the Northwest Ordinance has been used as a weapon to subvert the Constitution. But back to little old me. I wrote my first book in 2013, and 2012, and it was published in 2013. And I wrote that to basically refute academics. In other words, I didn't write that to deal with trying to teach people fundamentals. I wrote at the level where if academics were going to try to actually refute what I said, I made it impossible, because I used source documents in that. And so as I started diving into the ratification debates and the source documents and so forth, I started realizing that we actually have everything we need in the Constitution. And as a matter of fact, these source documents have been obscured, because one thing that's the reality, saving the Constitution, there's no money in it. There is no money in saving the Constitution. There's money in corruption. There's money in maintaining the status quo. But actually standing up, it's just like our forefathers, or I should say the framers, they put themselves into ruin, financial ruin. There was no money in it for them. The day they would have made it an entrepreneurial endeavor is the day it would have failed, because they had the blessing of the divine hand of providence who inspired them. As a matter of fact, if you read the first proclamation of Thanksgiving, George Washington, with a unanimous call from Congress, unanimous, both houses all voted to have him call for a proclamation of giving thanks. And in that proclamation, he asked the nation to set aside one day for thanks and giving thanks to him who gave us this Constitution. And it was a day of service, not gluttony. And just imagine where we would be if we actually maintained that tradition as a nation instead of picking up one of the obscure Thanksgivings, because there were several Thanksgivings. Almost every time a party would come to America through the rough season, what have you, they had Thanksgivings. As a matter of fact, they consecrated the land for both the king and for God and for Christendom, and everything that they were doing was a very ceremonious process, because the very first Thanksgiving was actually in 1619, and that was in Virginia. But anyway, I digress. I can go into all these little things. Forgive me for that. But bottom line is, as we go through the Constitution, you can actually start understanding what we need to do and how bad the Constitution is being violated. That's why I gave you the two color-coded constitutions. One of them actually highlights every violation in the Constitution. And we actually, if you look at the key code at the very top, we actually have a color code of how two amendments are violating the Constitution as well. The 16th Amendment violates the Constitution, and the 17th Amendment violates the Constitution.
Right. So before we get into that, GR, because I think we definitely want to dive into that, but I also like there's a dichotomy, and I think you've touched on this very nicely, in that here we have this Constitution, but it is clearly not being followed and abbreviated at every turn, especially in our state, in Washington State. And so how did you get to this place? Because you talked about, you wrote this book back in 2012. And Michelle, I just muted your mic just because there was a little bit of feedback. I want you to chime in too. But there was getting some feedback. So, but how did you get from where you were then to what you're focused on now as a remedy to this? Because I think what I've heard from you and learned from you, Michelle, and you, GR, is that you are approaching this in a very specific manner,
Right.
as far as a remedy.
Sure. And as a matter of fact, I am following, technically, it's not intellectual property, but because nobody ever did it, I've kind of created the intellectual property so that nobody can come along with big pockets and say, I want to buy that and take that away, or because it hasn't been established, they establish it, then they want to take it or shovel it or what have you, because believe it or not, patents have been a huge problem of ours. And so that's how they've buried technologies that, we wouldn't be in this place today if it wasn't for these unconstitutional patents and copyrights. Bottom line, if you read what Madison and Jefferson did in 1798, they actually set out exactly what needed to be done. And they basically built it all upon the basis of the Constitution and how the Constitution was ratified and so forth. So if you're familiar with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, this is where they actually said, okay, we're standing up and we're going to hold the federal government accountable for violating the Constitution. And in a nutshell, I'll just kind of cover this really at a high level. In the Kentucky resolutions, this is where Jefferson audits the Constitution and these laws. He looks at the laws and he says, this law, there were 4 of them. And he goes, in each of the different resolutions, he identifies how each law is violating what part of the Constitution. And then he basically, in Resolution 8, the draft that he sent out in Resolution 8, that got unanimously voted for. But nevertheless, what he sent out was he was calling upon the states to basically join in, that all the states needed to coalesce and hold the federal government accountable. And the response to the Kentucky resolutions was the Virginia resolutions. And it was like 2 months later, they actually, I think, promulgated it on December 24th. They didn't celebrate Christmas back in those days. They worked. And so in the Virginia resolutions, this is where Madison actually goes through the nuts and bolts of why the states, being the parties to the compact, the federal government is not the party to the compact. It's the creature of the compact. And actually, Jefferson points that out. The states are the parties to it. And so, as a fundamental principle, and Madison really dives into this in his report on the Virginia resolutions, that is a fundamental principle of contract law. When there's no resort can be had, in other words, see, the federal government has, let me back up. The federal government has jurisdiction constitutionally over all things arising under that Constitution. And the laws that they passed did not arise under that Constitution. So therefore, who has jurisdiction? The federal government can't, because that type of jurisdiction wasn't delegated to them. So this is where Madison said the only court that would have jurisdiction is the states assembled, and that the states would need to, as a majority of the states, would step in and basically force them into compliance. And that was their intent. The problem was Hamilton's big government federalists that basically took over the Federalist Party had such a grasp on Congress by this point in time, as well as many of the states. They basically said, we don't want to have anything to do with this. We kind of like this tyranny that, we're in favor of this. And as a matter of fact, if you read Jefferson's second resolution of 1799, he comes back and he actually says we can only lament based on the insinuations because they were charging these guys with treason. So as they moved forward, what they ended up having to do is they ended up having to use the Republican Party to basically commit a coup. And they only had 1 year to do it because it was 1799 when they finally realized that they weren't going to be able to force the federal government into action. So they went around on a campaign getting electors to choose Thomas Jefferson, as well as replacing enough people in the states to where this Republican Party actually unseated a lot of these, I'll just call them scoundrels. And so bottom line, they actually did something that's never been done before by using a party to actually correct the course of this nation. We've actually seen otherwise since then, where parties and actions, or I'll just say factions, have actually taken America in the wrong direction time and time again. And so if you really look at what he was talking about, they're basically talking about creating an audit of the states, where the states literally go through the Constitution, say this, you don't have the authority to do this. And therefore these laws, and Jefferson said this, these laws are null and void. And that the states would force Congress then to rescind those laws. If they didn't, within the Constitution, there's this extradite authority. All the states had to do was charge these men with treason in Congress and extradite them and actually replace them so that they would get enough in Congress to actually do the job.
But that's not what happened, correct?
No, that's not what happened. They needed enough of the states to actually do that, because if Kentucky and Virginia started replacing just theirs, they still would not have a majority in Congress. Does that make sense? So you have to have a majority of Congress, because when it comes to undoing a law, you don't have to have 3/4 in Congress. You only need a majority. And in the Senate, you needed 60%. So in passing laws and bills, but I think undoing things, it only required a majority. But that's not what they ended up doing. But that's the only process that we have of actually dismantling the And when I say Leviathan, I forgive me for going down another rat hole, but in 1816, when Madison was getting ready to retire, and his friends in Congress came over to visit him, they literally asked him, what kind of bill can we present, or what can we do to give this legislation that would be a hallmark to recognize your great service to this country? And he basically went into this little oration about the importance of improving the flow of commerce in America. He said, and he referenced Adam Smith's book, basically that if we could move commerce more efficiently from the interior to the ports and overseas and back and into the interior again, the faster and the more efficient we can become, the more, I'll just say, powerful this nation would be economically. And so they went off and created what was called the bonus bill. And they gave that to him before he retired. And as his last act, he vetoed it. March 3rd, 1817, he sent a veto admonishment back to Congress and said, look, the powers that you're displaying in this bill is not available to us in the Constitution. We have to amend the Constitution. And he actually identified that the necessary and proper clause, the general welfare and defense clause, the supremacy clause, as well as, what was the other one? I said commerce, general defense, necessary and proper, and the supremacy. All four of those clauses he pointed out and said, those are not portals to obtaining new power. We have to amend the Constitution if we're going to be in the business of improving the infrastructure at all in any way. So they went off and they were pretty upset. And they waited until 1822 with James Monroe, and they tried to give him a Cumberland Gap bill to do something very similar. He vetoed that. And basically in their bill, they actually used 6 justifications establishing post roads for the common defense, these types of things, where Monroe basically took all 6 of those. He listed them. He says, even if I combined these 6 justifications, the power does not exist within all of them combined. We have to amend the Constitution to do this. And then they weren't very happy with Monroe, so they waited until Jackson in 1830. And so in 1830, Jackson, they tried to get the exact same bill to establish a Department of Transportation or to create this bureaucracy. And he actually cited Madison's veto. He cited Monroe's veto in this long veto. And he says, if the good people of America want us to do this, then let's go get an amendment. I'm saying I went through this little history, this little story to basically lay out that the initial attempts to create the Department of Transportation was refuted by 3 presidents. And they laid out the constitutional argument that if the power is not delegated, they can't do it. So as we look today, where's the amendment for the Department of Transportation? There's not one patriot organization out there, not one, that's actually saying we got to get rid of the Department of Transportation. And look at all of the last presidents and even our current one. They've used the infrastructure as a way to boondoggle money out to their special interests so that they can wage warfare, political warfare, and so forth, and bolster up at the expense of the taxpayers.
Right. So
Okay.
you've laid out, I mean, and it's pretty obvious to most of us, right, is that there's a huge problem. We have a huge problem in our country, in our states. And what we read in the Constitution is not what we're seeing played out. So we've got these problems. You've talked about some of these. And we had a question, by the way, by one of our viewers. Make a list. I'd love a list of things related to this that I can read. So do you have some, first of all, some suggestions for some places for them to go to kind of start to learn more? And then let's talk about where we are right now and what do you see? How do we correct this? How do we have a tangible fix, if you will, that we can start working on? And are you seeing this here locally? Michelle, do you have thoughts as far as, you know, maybe some helpful items? GR, you are such a huge encyclopedia of information. You know, it just like comes right off the top of your head. But for most of us, I think we need some simple little things to grasp to help us understand the complexity, some of these huge, you know, critical elements of the things that we're missing right now.
Well, his website, Reclaiming the Republic, has the ratification debates outlined, and as there's recordings as you go through it, he stops and explains, because it's written in our founding framers' language. So it takes a little bit of gymnastics of our mind to understand, you know, this is what they're saying and this is what they're meaning. But GR has done that gratefully. And that really is, it's not a short education process, but it's a necessary one to be standing on firm ground. There's also a number of, I want to kind of move to an application of what's called the First Amendment petitions. These were given to us by the framers. They exist in Washington State today. Some of our viewers today might be familiar with the Sportsman Alliance First Amendment petition that Glenn Morgan just laid down at Governor Ferguson's lap and stated with annotation and proof that 4 wildlife commissioners have committed malfeasance, they've broken the Public Records Act, and they've broken the Public Open Meetings Act, among other things, and that they should be removed. Now, if our governor swears to uphold the Constitution of Washington State, he would move immediately to do so once that he's gone through that and checked all the things that Glenn Morgan has submitted. This is a petition. It looks very familiar to what some people may be familiar with as an initiative. Initiatives were supposed to be the law of the people in this state, and yet we saw this last year where they totally shredded that. Why does they have the right to do that? Where's the mechanism to check and balance our government? So for me, the initial documents were about creating a constitutional committee, and it started at the county level. So GR has been talking about the states to the federal level. It's very similar with counties to the state level. And GR, why don't you explain why counties matter? Because I think that's a good segue for our listeners.
I think, and I love that, because I'm all about, local action, getting involved. I think so much focus gets focused on the federal level and what's going on in the nation, which is important, but we have so much more opportunity for impact at the local level. So GR, do tell us more about that.
Okay, so this all starts with our history. What did our forefathers do when they were being oppressed and being denied their rights as Englishmen? In England, and under the Britannic Glorious Bill of Rights and the Magna Carta, and within the monarchical theocracy, you got to remember that Britain was a monarchical theocracy when we decided to revolt. And they had been that way since King James created the King James Bible. When they created the King James Bible, that became the King's Bible. And that was the Bible of the land. And Blackstone basically said that was the basis of our law. Well, so these rights that were being denied us, they were just asking for representation. We'll take the tax, but we deserve representation. And so what did they do? When they were being oppressed, and the king, actually, I think it was around 1763 when he dismissed the governments of the colonies and imposed his own governors. And so what they did was they actually started organizing under the rights of the Magna Carta, as well as the Glorious Bill of Rights, the right to assemble, and then the right to petition. And so they created these, what they referred to in the Tory Acts as the provisional governments. They were called committees of safety. They were councils. They were assemblies. You see today these names being resurrected in committees of safety, jural assemblies, those types of things, because that is all under that umbrella of the monarchical theocracy of the rights of an Englishman. Today it's different under the Constitution, but it's the same. But it's not, because we don't have a monarchical theocracy. We have a republican form of government, which is a constitutional republic, where the Constitution is the supreme law. So our common law has to be based upon the Constitution. And so anyway, I don't want to get into common law, but bottom line, as they started organizing, they started petitioning the king and saying, we have rights. We have a right for representation. We have these ultimate rights that are right there in the Magna Carta. Because the Magna Carta created Parliament. Most people don't know that, but Parliament was created as a result of the Magna Carta. And that's when they literally changed the form of common law in England from a judge system to a representative system, quasi, but the king was still the top dog. He was the guy that actually could trump over Parliament. And so anyway, the point is the provincial government started getting more and more organized. It took 10 years or so before they actually finally came to a boiling point where they started organizing as colonies. They actually started organizing what they call the ultimate coup d'etat, was the committees of correspondence. What these local, I'll just say these county governments, what these county representative bodies did was they created a committee of correspondence for the county. This is where they were starting to communicate between the other colonies to say, what are you guys doing? What are we doing? Because they said, we need to start uniting. We need to form a union. And so that's when they finally formed the Articles of Association and Continental Congress. And actually, when they did the Articles of Association, they also did an ultimate petition to the king, basically saying, and if you've ever read the Articles of Association, I mean, the colonists are saying, we're your most loyal and faithful servants. We love you. but we are not going to take this. We have rights and so forth, and this is what we're going to do. That's all laid out in the Articles of Association and in the pleas and the petition. They were pretty much hand in hand together. And then after that, they kept petitioning the king. And in the Tory Acts, because the first Tory Act actually went out in 1775, when actual hostilities were really starting to kick off. And so this is when the first Tory Act basically went out to the provincial governments and said, we need you to arrest all of these loyalists. And they kind of came back and said, do you realize what you're asking? They've actually got the king's army supporting them. That we can't do that. So the second Tory Act on January 2nd, 1776, they came back and go, okay, we want to win a campaign on information. This is about liberty. We need to convert and win these people over to basically start supporting the cause of liberty. And so in March, in one of the next Tory Acts, they basically went out to the provisional governments for a query. It was a data call. They said, please send us all of your petitions and the responses you received. This is all basically filling what's going to go into that Declaration of Independence. That's why Thomas Jefferson said, we have petitioned and petitioned and petitioned, and you have failed to redress our grievances. That redress of grievances goes all the way back to chapter 61, or I think it's actually paragraph 61 of the Magna Carta, where the king basically promises, if you petition and I fail to redress your grievances within 40 days, my entire kingdom is yours. Well, I don't think the king felt much of a threat from the colonies all the way across the Atlantic that they were going to come and take his kingdom. And so he basically ignored them. And Parliament basically ignored them. And we know what happened historically. But bottom line, this was the beginning of the evolution of America and a slow transition away from the monarchical theocracy into a new form of government that still confounds people to this day. And anyway.
Yeah, so let's talk about then how that applies. Michelle had kind of kicked that off with mentioning the counties to the states, and
Correct.
I know there's some things going on here in our state as well with some counties. So how does that then apply? During right now, real time, and how can we utilize those type of opportunities and strategies to impact what's happening to us, all these unconstitutional things that are happening to us.
Okay, so
go ahead.
We started creating petitions. I started creating petitions with Bob Schultz out of the We the People Foundation. And there was a very large foundation. He had the Continental Congress meeting, I think in 2009, but he was the one that really helped me understand how we had to use First Amendment petitions. And so we now have a petition page, which is a national repository of petitions that literally lay out arguments. Like petition 2 is a constitutional argument that proves that Congress cannot make a treaty, cannot agree to a treaty if that power is not enumerated within the Constitution. The Supremacy Clause even says that. Treaties made under their authority. So if it's not enumerated, they don't have the authority to make that treaty to subjugate us to the UN and to subjugate those laws to us. That has to be a very specific delegated authority to Congress. And because they're signing up with all these treaties, and guess what? All of these things were dealt with in the ratification debates because these same arguments were brought up in 1788. And in 1788, George Nicholas basically says, hey, look, if they try to pass a treaty that's not within their authority, one, it's not applicable. They can't make any kind of treaty that's repugnant to the Constitution or not within their delegated powers.
Yeah.
So why are the ratification debates so important? I think this is really key to before we move a little bit further. When we go through a contract and a contract negotiations, let's just say, MJ, I'm selling you a car. And I just use this metaphorically. I'm selling you a car and you're going to pay cash, which means you're not going to have a standard contract of financing or anything like that. So we just try to cut to the chase. And I try to get you to pull the trigger. And finally, I do this. I stipulate that if you buy this car today from us now, and, when you leave here, every week that you own this car, you can bring the car back for a free wash and wax. And we'll wash and wax your car for every week that you own that car. And you go, that's a deal. That's a great deal. You jump up and we go in and you give me the cash and you sign a little agreement that you're going to insure the car, that you're going to, do all the legal things, register it, because you actually have to sign a little contract to do that. And you come back the next week and go, okay, I'm ready for my car wash. And I go, oh, crud, I didn't put that in the contract. Everybody knows that legally I am still bound by that. But if you can't prove it, then that's your burden to prove. It's your word against mine. And that's how scoundrels get away with, bad behavior. The ratification debates, as they stipulated what every single one of those lines meant, as the Federalists laid out, no, this is what this means. They wrote it down, which means that those are legally binding. As a matter of fact, Madison, in almost every debate, when they were pressing issues that were unconstitutional, he would constantly point to the ratification debates and say, this is how the Constitution was sold and understood. Throughout his entire life, his entire career, never once did he point to the Federalist Papers, never once. And as a matter of fact, we've refuted the Federalist Papers as even being an authority because of what Hamilton did to him in the very last throes. The last 8 Federalist Papers were all basically done to undermine the Constitution. Putting that aside, the ratification debates were read when they were trying to assume a bank by Madison in Congress. He actually read these things to say, this is how the Constitution was defined. What we're doing is we're going down a path where we don't have this authority. And so in 1821, after the Missouri Compromise and some bad verdicts were coming out of the Supreme Court, a group of men went to Madison and said, please give us your notes on the Constitutional Convention so we can understand this. This is in a letter from Madison to John G. Jackson. He basically says, I'm not going to give you those because whatever we thought in the convention doesn't matter. What only matters is how the states understood the Constitution at the time of ratification. That's what we have to live by because that's the tenets of contract law. And there you go. And not one lawyer in the world, unless he is actually a God-fearing man that understands these fundamentals, would actually stand up and say that, because lawyers get paid to bend the law, recreate law, which is absolutely all unconstitutional in the first place.
So I want to step in here. So when Washington State went from being a territory to a state, they were supposed to follow common law. But what we're seeing very evidentially is that we're practicing case law. There are 2 Washington constitutions. There are 2 U.S. constitutions. And so the reason counties matter is that the state was not started and said, okay, we're going to make this county here and that county there. It didn't start that way. The counties, just like GR described, the colonies coming together and becoming states and having those correspondence, say it again, articles of correspondence, they started coming together. The people, we the people consent for the governed to govern us. They made the state here in Washington State. Then they elected representatives to come together and with their making their wishes known, build a state. And they did that. But what's happened now is everything goes to the court. People think everything is settled in the court. Well, that's a judicial system. And our founding framers said that's the lowest form of government power. It's not supposed to be directing and making laws from the bench. Absolutely not. McCleary was a clear act of making law in Washington State from the bench. They replaced all of the legislators, did their own research, and they adjudicated with the majority of the party we have now under Inslee and committed a crime against our country, our state. And so we've lived with that, but I think it's coming to a boiling point. And so there's many issues. That's one. Then there's the chemtrails. That's actual chemical warfare. Where's the mechanism to resolve that? It's having our county legislators appoint committees and be trained by the ratification debates and have bylaws, which we have already developed. And in fact, we've already started in Stevens County. Now they're getting ready to do the search for the people. But the time is of the essence, in my view. We have many, many other issues where our constitutional rights have been violated. We're experiencing in Washington State and everywhere in the country an invasion. This is not anything to do with race. It has to do with a naturalization process that the federal government appointed to the states to obey. Our state is not doing that.
Right.
Everything is supposed to be done prior to them becoming a citizen. They're supposed to take a naturalization class. They're required to read, write, and speak English well. And our state is doing a tremendous disservice, kind of taking it from the farm workers group and giving them permanent residency, which does give them a social security number, because then we tax their wages, their kids go to school here, and they contribute, but they're not allowed to vote. And that's where everything has gone incredibly wrong. The thing is, people say they have habeas corpus. They do not, because they invaded. They did not go through the process. I went to Mexico recently. I had to jump through hoops just to go for a week or so visit. I could never walk into Mexico and do what they did. I can never walk into Canada and do what's been done to us. But we, the people, have to pick up our First Amendment petition that we have in this state and say, here's where you have violated the U.S. Constitution, and demand compliance, just like they did with the king.
So they're doing this. You're starting to see this happen at the county level. You mentioned Stevens County, where they're have a committee, I believe, correct? And they're starting to look at what are the grievances, what are the places where the state is not following the Constitution. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they're calling it an assembly. As a matter of fact, every county commissioner, supervisor, whatever the legislatures of the county are, they have the choice of whatever they want to call it. They could actually call it a grand jury if they wanted to, but the function of a grand jury is really more focused on basically providing indictments. They can actually do declarations, but an assembly can do that. An assembly does petitions and so forth. So using the right apparatus, but it is a body of representatives of the people that become educated. They have the same power in an assembly as a grand jury by subpoena. They can gather the data, they can gather the information, and they can provide the actual clarity to direct their representatives at the county level that the annotated Constitution is an abomination to the Constitution. It subverts the Constitution. It is not within the authority of the federal government to have a rewritten or living Constitution. Ergo, it must and cannot be used as law in this county. Now, Andrew asked a question, so I'm going to answer, because he asked about what's the difference between the right of petition versus instruction. And in the Bill of Rights, during the debates in Congress, the Bill of Rights actually stated the right of petition and instruct. It came down to this: if you're properly petitioning, you are instructing. So they dropped the instruction to just simplify it in your petition. And if you read all of our petitions, we identify how things are being violated, who's doing what and what has to be done. And then we also have very set expectations at the end of these things for what our county commissioners, because 9 times out of 10, your county commissioners are going to say, oh, well, we don't have the authority. We can't do this. And actually, they do have the authority to do everything we're telling them to do. There's 8 steps. They have the authority to do all 8 of those things at the end of each of those petitions.
And so, and you can find these petitions at the reclaimingtherepublic.org. Okay. And all
it's
of
on
those
the petitions page. So the site menu's on the right. I'm right thinking. So the site menu being on the right, just click on the petition button and it'll take you there. It's old school. I get it. And it's probably got more content than many people want to absorb. But anywho.
So to refute the idea that this is just a great idea and it's another kind of, philosophy that might work, let's take to a proof of performance. South Dakota has Governor Noem, very popular, and the legislature wants to make Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. And she vetoed it properly because the Constitution says it must be backed by gold and silver, and cryptocurrency and Bitcoin are nowhere near that. So a group of people that had listened to GR and understood how to write a First Amendment petition went and wrote one up, and they sent it to all the legislators. And they stated, if you do this, Amendment 14, Section 3 says you are not upholding your oath to defend the Constitution, therefore you will be removed from office. It changed that vote. Her veto stood, and that was just a few people. One person could do this. I mean, it's harder because it's just one voice out of so many in our state, but it's harder in the intestinal fortitude it takes. But they're going to try to take this to the courts, and we're not going through the courts. Another thing that people talk about is, well, Washington State doesn't have grand juries. We don't have those. Well, we actually do in this regard when we're redressing the grievances with our government because of the equal footing doctrine that was given to us during the ratification. And ratification is a contract. We agree, as other states ahead of us, to uphold the Constitution. And maybe some people, I think most of the people on this particular podcast know what a grand jury is, but a lot of people don't necessarily know what that is. It's funny when I talk to people, their eyes kind of glaze over, but it's a group of people assembled, and randomly picked to look at the law, what happened, and rule.
Yeah. So we pulled up the website here, reclaimingtherepublic.org, and here is lots of obvious, amazing content that you have here. And we were talking about the petitions, so I would imagine this is where you would go right here. Okay. And you've got them laid out there. So that's, that's very helpful. Very helpful.
Yeah. So in a complete petition, you actually want to identify names of people who deliberately violated their oath and the consequences of that, because that's all in the instructions of the petition. It's a petition for the redress of grievances. That is a constitutional right that cannot be abridged. As a matter of fact, you can go in front of your county and say, I am giving you a First Amendment petition for the redress of grievances. They tell you have 3 minutes. You can then inform them that if you're comfortable with abridging my rights, that's fine. I'll go talk to the sheriff about arresting you, because the sheriff has a responsibility of protecting my rights. And if they're going to actually abridge my rights, because any diminishment of the process of a First Amendment petition for the redress of grievances, that's constitutionally protected. And that's applied to the states as well, due to the 14th Amendment under Article 1, Section 14th Amendment, Section 1, no state shall make or enforce any law that abridges the privileges or immunities of a U.S. citizen. So if they create a rule like you got 3 minutes, that's okay if it's bitches and groans and moans and so forth. But if you're actually petitioning them, that 3 minutes can't apply.
So is there a difference between, with these petitions, can you do it individually, which it sounds like you're saying, if you wanted to go in front of your county commissioners, you could do, but you could also, I would imagine, do it as an organization or assembly or committee. Is that correct?
So the power is in the people, and the problem is getting, herding cats, right? The problem is getting all the people to unite. And so as long as you've got people that want to be contentious and, they want, this is what we got to do or what have you, we've got to unite on full compliance with the Constitution. We can't cherry pick the Second Amendment. We can't cherry pick. The entire Constitution requires full compliance. Now, Martin Luther created a compendious summation of grievances in his thesis to the Catholic Church. There were 95 theses. He just created a complete, what he found going through the scriptures. These were all the grievances, and he set it off with the intent that the Catholic Church would, fix their problems. That in itself was a petition. And the Catholic Church decided to ignore it. So what did Martin Luther do? I don't think he had any intent in trying to become an activist and in reforming Christianity. I think he really had, because he was a naive young man going through the priesthood. I think he, thought that these guys would want to get it right. And they may, slap him on the back. Hey, good job for correcting us. But that's not what happened.
No.
What ended up happening was he had to actually get the Bible printed in the Germanic languages and actually prove to the people exactly, because the advent of the printing press just happened. I mean, that was brand new technology. And so he started printing it into the Germanic languages, and the royalty as well as the people all agreed that they needed to reform Christianity. It took him 10 years to do it. And see, that was an issue regarding the salvation of themselves. I mean, with God. I mean, that's a big thing. Convincing people to do that. Looking at the Constitution as a compact, and they only have this authority, getting people to stand up and say, we want this enforced. And if you're fighting, people go, no, 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 it's got to be about abortion. No, 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 it's got to be about DEI. It's got to be, no, it's about the entire compact.
Yeah. So
Because-
question about application here, because I want to get back to the county level. So you're talking about people can come together at a county level. Now, how do they do that? Do they have to be appointed by somebody in authority?
So
You can do it one of two ways.
the best way to do it, because they can actually do appointments and they can just appoint people. You can volunteer, and I think the best way to do it is to mature this process so that the people of the county select the people of their vicinage. And counties are broken up into districts. Most all political structures are broken all the way down. I think even in Louisiana, they have precincts, even though in Louisiana they have parishes, not counties.
We have precincts here. Yeah.
And so as we look at, how we're going to, move forward, I think the way to finally get to that point is having elections for this Constitutional Compliance Committee. Because by doing that now, because when you get onto this committee, you can be thrown off just like that if you try to suggest anything or try to promote anything that would be a violation of the Constitution. You may like certain things, like you may like social education, those types of things. But the fact the federal government doesn't have the authority to do it means that we have to stand up and say we have to oppose that. That's an infraction, and all infractions must be opposed. Those are Madison's words in the Virginia resolutions.
Well, and I kind of asked that question a little bit tongue in cheek, because I would imagine that most people in authority that are, elected officials probably are not going to jump on the bandwagon of this. Not that they're ill intent or, they have, are doing a bad job, but this could, threaten their livelihood as an elected official. So that's the reason why I asked this question. It does feel like there's got to be some authority with we the people to be able to assemble, which I know there is, but to have some, as coming together without having to wait on people that are elected officials to appoint this, or, I love your idea of, okay, let's elect this, but, quite honestly, our election system in our state is really awful. So I wouldn't count on that being a practical, opportunity anytime soon. Yeah, go ahead, Michelle.
Say something. So they can also ask people to volunteer to be on that committee. They don't have to be appointed. They don't have to be elected. They could say, hey, we have this committee. We need people to volunteer, and people from the different districts can come in. There's a built-in check and balance where those people actually have to swear an oath to uphold the Constitution. So they can't, if they breach that, they're accountable already and they can be removed. So once the assembly is there, I see your point, but I also kind of believe there's an unrest in our country like no other. I think some people want the federal government to take care of them, or for the state government to take care of them, that our representatives are hired or elected to do this. And I'm seeing the remarks by Andrew, I hope I'm saying your name right, Poing. He's saying the power is in the people, and that's correct. So the first thing we have to do is check ourselves. What are we doing to protect our Constitution, to check and balance and make sure that our government is doing the right thing by us? And it does take it's not an automatic, let's get a few meetings together and we'll write up this resolution and off we go. There's a bit of an education, a relearning of who we are as Americans. And once you grab onto that, you will not let go. Yeah. And because then you realize, I'm never going to be the Baronelle Stutzman. Even under the Washington State Constitution, Article 1, Section 11 said she had a freedom of conscience to believe what she believed and walk in it, not forced to do anything as a private business owner and a person.
Right.
That was a violation. So where does this go? I'm going to hop forward just a little bit so people understand. So I come back. Let's say the committee has been filled. They've taken the oath. They've done the study, and they come forward with a First Amendment petition. And they say, and by the way, you can gather as many signatures as you want ongoing. It's not controlled by what the initiatives are. And you don't have to turn those names over. You just say, I have this stack of petitions. You never have to turn it over. And we have a big disclaimer on people who sign up on our petitions that they're protected.
Nice.
So
yeah.
Yes, that enables people to speak out when they know that there can be tremendous repercussions, especially from those in power who think that they know everything.
Right.
You know? And
So
yes,
go ahead, Michelle. Sorry.
so yes, our commissioners would have to be worried about who's on there, but the only thing they really have to worry about is when they bring the resolution forward, they look at it and bring it into compliance. And so I'm going to take the example of being invaded. Okay, we are invaded. We presented the proof. County commissioners, you need to go to the next level. So there are groups of counties that meet together and they share information, and those counties can review the information, because if they don't do anything, here's the check and balance for the commissioners. The Amendment 14, Section 3 says, if you don't uphold your oath to protect the Constitution, you are now going to be put online to be removed from office. Yeah, it's serious, but it's also very empowering, the fact that I must do this. And then they call for a special session and say that the legislature needs to come in and review this with us. And if they don't act, or if they find that they have done things to create this invasion in our state, they're now subject to Amendment 14, Section 3. And so it's very powerful, just like that few little people that send a little letter to the legislator saying, we want cryptocurrency, and the governor's already vetoed it. And they said what stopped it wasn't her veto. It was the people saying, you're going to be removed from office.
Right.
And they understood it. Our state will probably have a little bit of a learning curve at this point.
Yeah, just a little bit. GR, thoughts on that? So I know you had to step away for a second.
So nothing can be enforced until the people demand it.
Correct.
Right? If the power's in the people, it isn't really there unless it is united. See, the problem with constituents, and the uniqueness about our Constitution, is we're a constitutional republic that represents not the people, the sovereigns. The people are sovereigns, and the governments we create are sovereign. We're not a democracy. If we're a democracy, then the people are sovereign in all things, and we make the laws. We have to vote on the laws. Everything's done by we, the people, and we all have full say. We don't have representation. And so that's one of the reasons why the unicameral, and the bicameral legislative bodies was very important. As a matter of fact, at the time of the Constitution, in the South Carolina ratification base, they lay out the differences between all of the state forms of government. And the United States, or this new union, was being formed with 3 separate branches instead of a single magistrate. And in addition, in the legislative branch, there were 2 different houses. There was the representation of the people and the representation of the people's government, who actually had equal suffrage in the Senate. Now, the people were to be represented by 30,000 to 1 representative. So for that 1 representative to represent those 30 people, or 30,000, they would have to have a consensus to kind of have a good feeling to how they should be voting. The state legislature is a lot easier because that's a smaller group of people, and getting the state legislature to actually have a unified voice could actually happen. The reason they created the government the way it was is because real-time government didn't exist. They didn't even have the concept. We actually have the ability today to actually do that. That's one of the reasons why I wrote a new article that's the truth about the 17th Amendment. See, the 17th Amendment, most people say it took away the equal suffrage in the Senate. It didn't. The equal suffrage in the Senate is protected in Article 5 of the Constitution, that no amendment can be passed. This thing called this Amendment Protection Clause in Article 5 actually ensures that no state can lose its equal suffrage in the Senate without their consent. So if they don't ratify something that would take away their consent, then they can maintain it. But they can't even pass an amendment to force them to do that, because that's what the Amendment Protection Clause does. So if the 17th Amendment actually touched Article 5 and said that the states will lose their equal suffrage in the Senate, then it would violate the Constitution itself. There are 2 amendment protection clauses. One that was an amendment that would stop the shutting down of the slave trade, and the protection or the equal protection of the state's legislature suffrage in the Senate. These were two of the biggest issues during the Constitutional Convention because the small states were very threatened by the big states that they would overpower them and take over.
Right.
And so in that concept that was actually embraced at the federal government, the Constitution became the exemplar in checks and balances and the most balanced way of governing. This is one of the reasons why every state started adopting and every state created bicameral legislative bodies. Unfortunately, people didn't understand the nuances of sovereignty. So, do the people have the power to declare war? Do the states? Do the county? No, only Congress. So, whoever has the ultimate say on that one power, that one issue, they're sovereign. So, we have this, it's kind of this advanced level, right? In the old days, it was very simple. The king was the sovereign, God was sovereign, and you were sovereign over yourself. So we actually built upon a very complex concept that was simple in most people's minds. And so when we look at our counties, if we establish our counties, then they become our sovereigns on the things we delegate to them. That's the whole point of a constitutional republic. How many counties have constitutions? So what happened so that the states could get admitted into the union really quick? And instead of actually educating everybody, okay, you have to create a constitution for your county. This is how you got to get organized to become a state. But every state that joined the union, they were all formed based on delegations from the counties. So the counties were being created by the federal government. They had, in the Article 4, Section 3, they have the authority to make needful rules and regulations for the territory. So they were trying to help, jumpstart these territories to become states. The motive for the federal government was apportionment, because as soon as that state joined the union, they could tax them. They can't tax the territory.
Wow.
And so, whether it was noble, what have you, bottom line, they did things. We let them do things. And so there's a lot of little things that, as you start digging through this, you go, yeah, we need to actually have a county constitution. And then in so doing, and I talk about this in Why Counties Matter Most, it's kind of like a mini book, but it lays this out to where as the counties create their constitutions, they can't take force until you rewrite your state constitution. And the reason being is because most of the powers are going to be taken away from the state and be given to the counties. That the states become general governments in the same model that the federal government serves the states, the state government will serve the counties. And so in so doing, one of the first things that needs to be listed in that new constitution for the state is all powers not delegated to this state are reserved to the people in the counties respectively.
So you asked the question, how many counties have a constitution? Little tongue in cheek there. Is there any?
I'm not aware of one. I have a national radio show and I keep on asking, hey, if you know of one, let me know.
And you're not just talking about Washington State? Are you talking about
I'm talking about, I have a national radio show on Red State Talk Radio. And so I work with teams in New York who actually, they were one of the original 13. They actually created committees of safety. And so with the people I'm working with in Orange County, Wyoming, all over the place, as we go through their constitutions, none of them, just for expediency, they just went to the state and gave everything to the state. Now I think we're starting to realize the bad acting that the state can really do and why it's important to peel that power back.
Yeah.
Right.
Is there, and that's what it seems. Oh, go ahead, Michelle.
Andrew is asking, who is the local legislative body? The answer is your county. They are your first line of legislators. The city municipalities do have authority over speed zones and general functioning together, but they don't have the powers that the county has. They're separate but subject. There's some overlap. And then he asked, a home rule was the first trip. Home rule is the reason a county can create its own constitution. Home rule. It's in the Washington State Constitution.
Yeah, but see, that's kind of been a little bit perverted. Bottom line, the essence that came out of the Constitutional Convention was self-determination. As a matter of fact, when you look, if you go through, because I do this on my radio show, I actually read these documents. So I'm not an entertainer. I actually read, and I have somebody that helps me, and she reads, and we talk about what we just read. And so when we went through Madison's notes on the Constitution, we actually talked about how new states being admitted into the Union evolved. Originally, the states were actually to be diminished in power. The new states that joined, they wouldn't have equal representation. They weren't going to have the same powers. And so everybody liked that except for a few people. And it was primarily the Virginians that said, hey, you guys know what you're doing? You're doing exactly what Britain did to us. You're creating a future war between the new states and the states that have more power. Because if we're going to be the central power and making sure that we're overpowering everybody else, they will join together in war with us. That was where the equal footing doctrine was established, because self-determination was essential. When a state joined the Union, they had to determine their labor, whether they're going to be slave or not. They actually tried to get rid of slavery, and all of the delegates all said, if we could get rid of it today, we would. Even the three southern states said, if we signed up with this and put that into the Constitution, they would not join the Union. And so the mistake that they made was making this compromise, the political compromise of maintaining slavery. So we could talk about the analysis and all of that, but it doesn't matter. The point is that there are key things that come out of the Declaration of Independence, right? We, the people, institute our government. If you have a government that has been instituted for you by another government, then you have a right to stand up and change and alter that government and or abolish it, especially if it's not doing its job in protecting your liberties.
Right. Which I think that, a lot of people are outraged, when they read the Constitution, and we need to get back to that integral understanding of what the Constitution says, what it doesn't say, but, become personal again with that. But again, how to do that? How do people, take this? They can see the dichotomy in what is happening versus what the Constitution says. So how do we practically help people be informed and then also take the appropriate action,
right,
and make an impact?
Okay, so that all happens at that Constitutional Compliance Committee, Assembly, Council, whatever you want to call it, in your own county. And so they start establishing, because if you look through the petitions, like I said, there's 8 steps. The very first step is one, forming this committee and giving this committee the charge to do some very specific things. One of the things that they have to do is they have to determine, does the federal government have the authority to maintain their own and redefine the Constitution on their own based on case law? No. So the first thing they have to do is they have to actually lay out by the law, telling the county, the county legislators, that an annotated Constitution is an abomination. It is subversive and it has no force, cannot be used. Then the next thing they have to do is they have to definitize the Constitution. In other words, when you look at the Constitution, what does that line really mean? And then we have to turn back to the father of the Constitution. How do you do that? Well, he was very consistent in saying you have to use the ratification debates. And so you can create a bibliography and a tie to how every time that line was explained by the Federalists. See, in the debates, you actually have 2 forces, right? You have the opposing and the proponents. And so the assertions made by the opposers were actually making comments, and 9 times out of 10, all of the comments and assertions they were making were actually pointing to violations of the Constitution. I can use one example. Mason liked to point out that they could do this with the militia. They could do that with the militia. And everything that they were actually doing by taking over control of the militia was a direct violation of how the militia was to be formed and controlled. So what ended up happening is, this is one of the reasons why the Constitution was actually passed, actually ratified, without a Bill of Rights. And actually the whole point of helping people kind of understand this is, in contract law, you have powers of attorney. James Iredell of North Carolina one of the members of the ratification debates in North Carolina, as well as at Continental Congress. I believe he was not at Continental Congress, at the convention. Maybe he wasn't, but he points out that the Constitution is a limited and specified power of attorney, where there's only these limited objects delegated. And so he points out, have you ever heard of anybody that says you can sell my land? I have land in Consul and Orange, and so I give you the authority to sell my land in Consul, but you decide to also sell it in Orange. They can't do that in a limited power of attorney. Madison even uses the term of a limited power of attorney, that this is only delegating powers. There was no general power granted. So in other words, the federal government couldn't just do what they wanted to do. They could only do those specific things. And that's how the Constitution was bought into.
Well, and I think that, you have the understanding of what the Constitution is. You have the ratification debates that that we're supposed to go back to help counsel us on exactly what it means, what the intent is. So then again, I go back to practical application. So I know you are doing some work in Stevens County, or Stevens County is doing some work with this. You have a national talk radio show where you're talking about using this approach from the county level. Where else, what exactly is Stevens County doing? Because it sounds like they're doing something, which is great. And what else is happening across the states right now to try to further this? Because that seems like the action. We can inform ourselves about what the Constitution is and isn't, right? And then the action to help correct this great grievance that we all are experiencing in our, especially here in Washington State. How do we actually correct it? So I'm just curious what's going on in Stevens County, and are you seeing other movement on this across the states?
So in other states, you mean? So in other states, we've been working with the Wyoming GOP, and it's been a priority for them to pass the Republic Review bill for the state to actually initiate this. Because when you have the whole party, the state party, endorsing and supporting the Constitution, that takes care of a lot of noise. And so for the longest time, since basically 2019, when they actually put it as a resolution that this was one of our priorities, and actually Chairman Ethorn in the last this last session of Wyoming's legislative session, he basically said, this is our number one priority in having you establish this committee to start creating the dialogue with the other states and to actually start demanding full compliance, auditing the Constitution, getting things kicked off, just like what Madison and Jefferson did. This could technically happen at the state level. However, we found that there's so much corruption, there's so many little problems that we cannot ignore the county. And so I started working with the National Liberty Alliance in 2021 and started helping them lay out what is a constitutional county, because there was somebody running around that says, hey, if you join my association, I'll give you a certificate and make you a constitutional county.
Boy.
Okay.
Nice sticker, huh?
$50 or whatever it was, right? So as we look at what the exit criteria for constitutional county is, there's some very critical things. You actually have to have the militia. The county absolutely has to have the militia. And there are other little factors in that as far as a constitutional county. So I kind of laid that out for the National Liberty Alliance and said, these are the things that's the exit criteria for a county to truly be constitutional. It has to have a constitution. Right. So, I mean, like I think I laid it out with 7 or 8, whatever it was. But bottom line, as I started working with them and working with other county groups and local organizations in South Dakota, Wyoming, and so forth, Missouri, and even Montana, Georgia, I'm working with groups all over the nation and getting them to actually help wake up and get the county to start pushing and demanding constitutional compliance. What we're fighting is patriots. We're fighting patriots that want to go down the path of using the court system. When the Constitution was being violated, why did Madison and Jefferson not go to the Supreme Court? Because we are not a judiciary form of government. We're a Republican form of government, and Madison spells it out. You go to the parties. You have to get the parties engaged. So they actually started at the state level and getting the state parties to the compact, the federal compact, to hold them accountable. They thought that they could do it. And then they realized, oh, well, we got some real problems because we don't have people that are supporting the Constitution anymore. People are willing to make these basically breaches in the Constitution. So as we kind of look at who else are we fighting, we're actually fighting the party itself, because the party doesn't want to stand up on the Constitution. And as a matter of fact, because I go into this in detail, that when you really look at the fact that the party has platitudes instead of focus on the Constitution, if everybody decided to full support of the Constitution, that would fix everybody's problem. Would abortion go away? Absolutely. Federal funding or any government funding of abortion would be completely gone. It's the same thing with healthcare, would be completely gone. They don't have the authority to run the education system, our energy and strategic energy plans. They don't have the authority for the Department of Transportation. All of our problems go away when we unite. You have to you got to stop drilling down, and because every time you drill into a myopic issue, you turn your back on the rest of the Constitution. And so getting people to get away from that, and we're actually fighting other different patriotic groups like the Convention of States.
Yep.
They say, oh, well, we got to have this constitutional convention. There are the national sovereigns, or what do they call them? The state citizens, national citizens, the sovereignty group, the general assemblies. They're kind of all under what I call the secessionist group, because they believe everything that is being done by government is legitimate. And I challenge them, prove to me where they have the authority to create the Organic Act, to create corporations, to create these treaties. Everything that they've been doing are violations. I can prove all of that. And so the problem is that I have no idea why they don't want to give that up, other than they don't pay taxes or whatever it is. So there's basically these 7 different paths, right?
Yeah.
And there's the ardent, I'll call them the militia, gun toters, what have you, because most of those guys think that we have to go to an armed revolution. And actually we don't. We have a document that we can demand compliance to. The document is not the problem. We just need to make sure that every public servant is upholding their oath of office.
Yeah. And I think you touched on that earlier, and I definitely see that as a primary issue. And this is the challenge I have had with the Convention of States as well. It's the problem is not the Constitution.
Right.
The problem is it's not being followed. Why is it not being followed? Are we holding our electeds, accountable? Do we have these grievances? What are the tools that we can use to help ensure that it's being followed? And I know you have shared some other documents where you lay out where it is being followed, where it isn't being followed. Most of it's not being followed. So to have an amendment to the Constitution, well, what good is that going to do when it's not even being followed in the first place? Right. So, what are the tools? I think we need to back up and go, is that really the answer? Or how do we ensure that the Constitution is being followed, especially when you take your oath of office? I've held a couple different public offices, and each time I had to take an oath of office to uphold the Constitution of the United States and to uphold the state constitution. Well, we have plenty of officials that are not doing that, and passing laws in our state that are absolutely against the Constitution. So we need to back up. Michelle, what's your thoughts on? I know we've kind of covered just a whole bunch of stuff, but what other thoughts do you have on this?
I really believe it's an awakening, because GR is working in several states. I think that our country wants things to be constitutionally, and then things happen that say, well, you might listen to a comment. I'm just going to, for example, I'm not actually saying this, but they'll listen to Judge Napolitano say something about that's not constitutional. The question in my mind is he following case law, or is he actually following the Constitution? He's very good at what he does. He's very well intended. I think most people are, but we tend to flock to people of like-mindedness, and the like-mindedness needs to evolve to like constitutional mindedness. And that's why there is an educational or re-educational process involved where we go back and see these beautiful nuggets that have been around for hundreds of years. And that answers the question, why hasn't somebody else thought of this? Why isn't this actually happening? It's because we've elected people to office, and this actually is the Constitution was fought from the very beginning. So over time, we've actually lost touch with those very foundational original intent. But we do have a process. We're not under tyranny. We're pretty close in some cases, but we can take a First Amendment petition, put it together, and go to our county commissioners, who are our first legislators, and say, this is not compliant. You have to do something about it because Amendment 14, Section 3 says so. If you won't, then I need to have somebody else in office that will do this.
Right.
And that's that wonderful checks and balance that when we start understanding we all want the same thing. And it's not, I see Andrew asking what parties. Sometimes it's parties to the contract. Sometimes we're talking about the different political parties. And he also asked about maxims of law, which I did hear in that 2-hour conversation. I was very impressed with Andrew and what he was talking about because of the depth of study that he's done. And I hope that he and GR get together and talk a little bit.
So you're referring to that spaces that we did, and it's in my highlight section. If you're on X, we had a spaces on common law, kind of a similar a touch on the constitutionality or unconstitutionality of what we're seeing. Completely kind of different approach, and that's what I think is very fascinating by this, because we've seen different approaches and different techniques or tools, used or try to be used to be effective and to create change. And so I appreciate all these different, not tangents, but avenues to get at the same things. And if we can work together, we can figure out what is working, what isn't. And I think we've got, of course, we're going to have a few people in the conversation, and you're going to have as many thoughts about this as you have the people, right? And a different approach. But if we can keep coming together to kind of figure this out, I think we're going to get somewhere. We're going to do the trial and error. We're going to figure out what is effective, what works. Okay, maybe we got to go back to the drawing board on some of this. So the thing that is important to me as a takeaway is that we need to start building these, coalitions of people that are looking at, where we are not aligning to our Constitution at a local level, and creating those numbers. And I'd love to think that counties would just appoint this or do this in their own regard. But unfortunately, people go along to get along, and there may not be enough force or enough pressure on our local officials. Again, nothing against them, to do this in their own accord or at the state level. I applaud Wyoming, for doing that. And maybe we would have a legislator or two that could take that up, or maybe even our state party. But it seems to me that it takes people coming together. And the best way to do that, I think, is at the local level. So I want to kind of find out, what is Stevens County doing exactly? What have they done, and what are they working on?
Go ahead, Michelle.
Well, they're just now opening it up for people to come on board. We had to have a set of bylaws by which they would function. We needed certain things for the county to give us, such as a place to store documents and perhaps a place to meet, or at least facilitate a Zoom meeting, and some administrative needs from the county. So they had to agree to that. So now they're at the point of opening it up and having people come in. But because I do think that at least a lot of county commissioners on this side of the state are fed up.
Yeah.
They're fed up. They want to do something. They know things are wrong, but they don't have that tool. And we did present this to a number of Eastern Washington State counties. All but 3 were in the meeting. It's a regular meeting. It's not a hidden meeting. And we gave this to them, and they started thinking. And I had 4 counties say, I'm interested in what you're talking about. One in particular, I won't say which county it is, but they had 5,000 visits to the ER of people who aren't documented and using health services, and they're not paid for.
Right.
Plus they're having tons of murder and tons of crime. And they're just like, we need the governor to do something about this. Well, they passed Bill 5077 that says every state agency can enroll people to vote. No,
Yeah.
they can't. That's a violation. You know,
So in Stevens County, is that being done by the county? Is the county kind of constituted, if you will? Maybe that's the wrong term, but authorized this
yeah.
committee, or are okay, so the county led this effort. Is that correct?
Yep.
They have a resolution and they said we're moving forward, and what they needed was the bylaws. They have those now. And so now they're going to start recruiting people from the local area. And I believe that we're talking about this enough with a network of people that people are going to start looking at this. I love the idea, and a lot of people ask me, is this the same movement as getting a senator from every county? That's another idea that kind of looks at counties and why they're important, but that's not what this is. So I want to be sure that that's not confused in Washington State. But this is something that can work anywhere in the country, because
Yeah.
you go back. It's like if I had you, Jefferson and Madison, telling me, and I'm asking you, what does this amendment mean? The first article says that we must have a militia. Okay, and a militia must have weapons of war in case of an invasion. That's what the government told the states to do. Our state's not doing that. So when you start discovering, that we're literally taking the guns away and saying, oh, and the plea is, well, we need guns for hunting. You don't even understand your first article in your
Right.
Constitution, because they
Right.
go together. So when you start seeing this stuff, the light goes on. It goes on, and you want to know more. And I think as the county commissioners, who are very savvy, they're going like, okay, what is this? They're doing a good job of being discerning, and like they want to know more, but they started nodding their heads that this is a tool.
Yeah.
And they all jumped on board and wrote their own letters to back up Glenn Morgan's Sports Alliance First Amendment petition to the governor, say remove these wildlife commissioners because they're violating Washington state law.
Do you have the examples from Stevens County on your website, GR, of like how their resolution, or do you have links to where we can find that? So maybe other counties that might be interested in doing this don't have to reinvent the wheel, or maybe have something to start from.
Well, so the resolutions are actually on the Stevens County website.
Okay.
They were passed last year, I think November, December.
Okay.
The bylaws are still in their review. I've not heard anything from them. And actually, I have an action to Michelle to create an appointment to go up and sit in front of those fine legislators,
Okay.
and ask them, what's the holdup, and how can I help? I'm here to help, and I'm not from the government.
Yes.
That's an important last statement.
Well, the thing, what I understand is the clerk is going through it and putting the final touches on what we did, because there are Open Meetings Act rules. There are certain other technicalities to make it fit both Stevens County and Washington state law. That's what I think it is. But I'd be more than happy to go up and redress grievances and happily and in a friendly manner. Like, I want to help. I want to see you guys succeed. I want to see this little county. And I remember something that Michelle Bachman said: despise no small thing. It comes from the Bible. And a very good example, and I don't want to get too tongue-in-cheek about, because I know people have different views, but look at that tiny little country, Israel, how they stood up. Because they came together. There are always going to be some people that disagree. And what I love about Andrew and the people I'm seeing over here, Rick, they have done the same work. They're digging deeper. Why isn't this working? Where they're looking to grab onto the bars or the horns of the altar and say, this isn't right, and here's why. Yeah. And they found some answers. I think they're on the right track. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm saying let's come together. Let's share some more. And let's together look at those ratification debates and see what our founding framers said. And I think that will unite many people across many lines who are active in government policy. To me, this is a uniter. And if I could ever say that my deepest heart's wish is to unite our people and say, this is right and this is wrong.
Yeah, we've got to come together. We've got to work together. I know we've been going at this for a little bit. what kind of things would you like to leave people that are listening today with? Anything else, GR, that we haven't covered yet?
Well, so understanding the Constitution is key. And so if you had a chance to look at the enumeration, the color-coded Constitution of enumerations, see, every line in the Constitution is doing something. It's a delegation. What is it delegating? It's delegating a role. It's delegating a responsibility. As a matter of fact, it delegates roles and responsibilities to both the federal government as well as states. There are restrictions placed upon states as well as the federal government in the Constitution. And so what this color-coded Constitution does is it identifies these are roles and responsibilities. These are powers. These are restrictions. These are standards. And actually, it's a multifaceted color-coded Constitution, because there are certain areas and certain things that the federal government has the ability to create law on. In other words, in Article 1, Section 8, those are the enumerated objects of their powers to create law. They cannot create law. And so the very front end, you see the green, that means that they can create law in that area. Red, no, and black are restrictions, or the gray is restrictions. And then there's the color code. And then when you look at the preamble is not anything. It's just a preamble. And then you'll notice that the red is prevailing throughout Article 1 until you get to Section 8. And so Article 1 identifies Section 1. Those are roles and responsibilities. Section 2 starts off with standards. If you know how to split the document, you can maintain the color code so that when you're looking at that blue with gold lettering, those are actual standards. Those actually identify what they have to do. And they can't change. In other words, a representative cannot become a representative if they're 18 years of age or not a citizen. There are hard standards, and the only way to change any of that language is through an amendment.
A constitutional amendment.
Constitution, right. And the Constitution states that the people will not be represented, no more than 30,000 people will be represented by one person. In other words, they can't represent 1 million people. The only way Congress or our House of Representatives can represent more than 30,000 is via an amendment. That's one of the reasons why, if you go to the Bill of Rights, the very first amendment in the Bill of Rights was the Amendment of Apportionment. So if you go all the way down through the document, it actually has the Bill of Rights in there. And it lays out how to amend and how to change if you use the navigation pane, it'll help you. But yeah, if you go all the way down to the Bill of Rights. So the First Amendment identifies the process right there. Go back up. So there you go. There's the preamble to the Bill of Rights. There's actually 3 preambles in the Constitution. The first one, the preamble to the Bill of Rights, and the preamble to Section 8 of Article 1. That first yellow and green, that is an amendment that would actually change to allow the apportionment of representation to go from 30,000 to 40,000, and then from 40,000 to 50,000, and cap at 50,000. Why is it that Madison wrote that amendment? Because he knew you couldn't just arbitrarily change it. It would require an amendment. And they said, you know what? This is going to grow. This thing's going to catch on. And we need to create a standard, or at least provide a vehicle for them to have an amendment to do this instead of letting them arbitrarily do it. That right there is hard evidence that what Congress has been doing and actually changing the language that they don't have the power to do, they've been getting away with.
So, GR, are these documents that we're looking at here, are they on your website?
Yes, okay. Yes, they are.
Very good tool. And you said
So as a matter of fact, on my constitutional articles page, I have a lot of my articles, but I also have the debates in Congress. If you want to go through the Bill of Rights debates, that's there. If you want to go through the debates in Congress on the 14th Amendment, I defy anybody to prove to me that we became chattel in that 14th Amendment. It's never once mentioned. It was literally mentioned that the point was to make blacks, and what they did in the language, it actually made all slaves and even Indians, everybody under the jurisdiction of the federal government, are now citizens. That made Indian citizens. And nobody wants to talk about that because that's a new problem.
Interesting. Interesting. What and remind people again, what is your website for them to go?
ReclaimingTheRepublic.org. I have a contact page. You can email me. We can start talking. Yeah.
Yeah. And then also tell people when you have your radio show as well.
So it's 6 p.m. Eastern time, 3 p.m. West Coast time.
Okay. And where can they
Monday
find that?
through Friday. Monday through Friday. Now we're aired in certain venues, like I think in Ohio and Kansas and Florida, maybe. But you can stream us on TuneIn, on TalkStream Live. You can stream us directly from Red State Talk Radio.
Okay. And can they find the link on your website as well for
Yeah.
that? Okay, perfect. Okay, Michelle, final thoughts. What would you like to leave everybody with?
I see all the chats and I can see people's heads exploding a little bit. I know that they've dug deep on some other things, but the Lee Amundsen's, the Ricks, the Andrews, come talk with us and share for a while without just kind of look at what you know and where you got it and what you found here and see if you can come together. Because I see, you know, Maxims of Law. I heard Andrew talk about that a lot. And petition, there's a lot of comments there. I don't know if we can save the comments at all. It would be great. But
They are preserved under those chats. Yes.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So I know that this is an introduction. Maybe we can come back. I do plan actually to take a resolution on the invasion to the Franklin County Commissioners, with or without a committee, because we're just in a state of a window of time right now where we couldn't have done this under the Biden administration. And I don't expect the Trump administration to do everything for us. I spent 7 years on the Snake River dams, and we should have had an ESA exemption, and things should have been done in Idaho. And we came so very close to what's called the God Squad. So I know how much incredible work you can put into something and get this close. And I just encourage people, keep coming back, keep talking, and keep grabbing onto these concepts and start looking at those resolutions. There's a whole bunch of them there.
Yeah.
There's a whole
Michelle,
bunch.
do you have how do people reach out to you if they'd like to collaborate with you?
Contact me by my email. It's Coach Michelle, so CoachMichelle 16@gmail.com.
Okay.
And then from there, I'll give you my phone, and as we talk, and what I'm probably going to do is say, please come back and talk with GR and start working on these and start developing these. Just try this for a while. And because I think that everybody's got that instinct that we've got to go deeper. We haven't been able to do it through elections. We haven't been able to do it through initiatives. We haven't been able to do it through demonstrations. And now those are dangerous. I really think the American people and the citizens of Washington State are being cowed into a corner. And it doesn't matter if they're even the minority. The Constitution is supreme.
Yeah. Amen to that.
We need to use it.
Yes. Well, we need to know what it says, right? And we need to get better informed. And then we need to use it, and we need to know how to use it in a practical and tactical way. So GR and Michelle, thank you so much for being on here today, sharing, your expertise and your passion about this. I look forward to continuing working with you, collaborating. I welcome you back on if you've got new information, or you're seeing something that's working or not working. Please know that you have this as a tool to get the information out there to people. Another tool. I know you guys have many that you're using, but really do appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
The other reason I brought this forward is I'm very concerned about the hate crimes laws and the protections of our churches.
Great point.
I haven't seen anything moving, but I see a potential that makes me very concerned.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. For sure. Again, thank you all for being here. Thanks to all the people viewing in today. And go ahead and continue to comment under those platforms if you got questions or thoughts. And we'll make sure that GR and Michelle get to see those as well, and maybe can get some responses. But thank you guys, and blessings to you, and keep up the great work. We really appreciate your fight in this and your passion.
Thank you.
MJ. You're awesome.
God bless. Bye now.
Blessings.
Thank you. Take care.